Hello again. This is the third of the video casts for the Open University Gender Critical Research Network. We hope to be uploading new video casts speaking to academics within the network and from outside about every 2 weeks over the summer. I have the great pleasure of being joined today by Professor Alice Sullivan, who is a professor of sociology at the Social Research Institute at UCL. Alice, welcome.
Hi.
We're going to sit pretty much in the same sort of format that we did with Laura McGrath. The video will be about 30 minutes, and I'll try and timestamp the different discussions as we upload it. So the first thing I'd like to ask, Alice, you're a sociologist, how do you define gender critical?
It's a really interesting question, and I have to admit I'm somewhat ambivalent about the term, because I believe that sex is real and that it's socially salient. So sex exists and it matters. And I've always believed these things, and until very recently, nobody thought that people who believed these things had this special word, gender critical, to apply to them. I think the vast majority of people are gender critical without probably ever having heard the term gender critical. So I worry slightly that by giving a slightly grand name to beliefs which are simply true, I mean, there is no question that sex is real, that humans are mammals, and like all the other mammals, we reproduce sexually, and we have 2 sex classes which are necessary to human reproduction. And it's also not arguable that there is no social significance to that fact. And you could be anything from a feminist to actually very traditional and still believe those things. So I guess the critical comes in with being critical of gender, but actually what we're being hounded for is not so much being critical of gender, but actually simply being materialists about sex.
And just for people, because the people, as I understand, the people who are watching these video casts may be, kind of jobbing academics, but there are quite a few who aren't jobbing academics. So when you, as a sociologist, when you say material, what do you mean, please?
I mean materialist meaning just sex is out there in the real world. It's not just a feeling. It's not just a social construction. Gender is a social construction based on sex. So gender is a set of norms and expectations that are imposed on people, not by choice, but according to their sex. And and gender identity, of course, is a third thing, which is about people's internal sense of self. But as a sociologist, of course, for many years I used the term gender to refer to a social structure and a hierarchy. So I think it's very important. Yes, our world is socially constructed, but it's not socially constructed out of thin air. There are material facts, and we can't simply wish them away. And we can't make inequalities go away by refusing to name the basis of those inequalities.
Yes, I'd love to come back to that in a minute. One of the things that really struck me, you used a phrase, and again, I just want to pull out what you meant, that these categories are socially salient. Yeah, just help some of our listeners understand what you mean by that term, please.
Right, so sex is determined at conception, and it has an impact on your life potentially before you're even born. So if we look at self-selective, sex-selective abortion, for example, in many countries, more boys than girls are born because males have a higher social status than females. So your sex matters. And that's not biological determinism, because of course, the fact that humans are sexed doesn't imply that there will be a difference in social status, but the fact is that there is, and that it is based on sex. not based on how you feel, because obviously when you've just been conceived, you probably don't feel any way about it at all.
That's a whole other set of controversies. Let's not deal with that right now.
So, and then obviously as you go through life, sex matters, both for physical reasons and for social reasons. So you think of things like what we call the gender wage gap, which we should probably call the sex wage gap, because the word gender has become so vague and everybody means different things by it now. But I mean, usually when people say gender, they're using it as a synonym for sex. If we think of things like your area, criminology, it's so clear, you know, violent crime overwhelmingly committed by males and not by females, I mean, to a massive extent. But it's true of almost any area of life that you think of. So what subjects people study in their education, what occupations they go into, even things like whether you believe in God or not, are hugely predicted by whether you're male or female. So females are much more likely to be religious in our society, at least.
Wow.
You know, and social attitudes, voting patterns, everything. It's linked to everything. And so as a social scientist, I don't see myself as a specialist in sex or gender, but every empirical social scientist uses sex all the time in all their analyses, because to ignore it would be really odd.
Yeah, well, it would be in my mind, it would be to ignore perhaps one of the most enduring,
yeah,
not endearing, enduring social stratifications that there is.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it is females who bear children, and that has implications. And that doesn't mean to say that all of those implications somehow flow naturally from the fact that females are in that role, because obviously our society is changing, has changed, but you can't ignore that material reality. It doesn't make sense to pretend that that is not the case.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I want to go off on one about you know, how concepts like gender roles have kind of been lost a little bit recently, but we're going to ignore that because I'm mindful of time, and I really want to ask you about your ONS work. So just take us through what you've done around the ONS, and yes.
Right. So I became aware, no, I think this was in 2018 now, that ONS were planning guidance for the sex question, which would direct people to answer the sex question in terms of their gender identity rather than their sex. And this was particularly odd because at the same time, they were introducing a gender identity question. So that should have laid the foundation for them to say, okay, we've got sex, we've got gender identity, two distinct things. They're both potentially really important. You know, we can have an open mind on which is more important in different contexts. We're going to collect data on both of them. Everyone should be happy.
Can I just interrupt for a second? I'm right, aren't I, in thinking you by trade are also a quantitative social scientist? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, I'm a quantitative social scientist, and so for 10 years I led the 1970 British cohort study, and I, you know, have many years of experience in data collection and data analysis. So when I became aware of this, I thought, well, that's very surprising, and it seems like a mistake. And I sort of rallied the troops in terms of other quantitative social scientists to put in an objection to ONS to explain why we don't think this is a very good idea. And mindful that, you know, it's a sensitive issue, and people in many fields have been quite frightened to speak out about anything that sort of touches on the trans issue, although of course we didn't see it in terms of that so much as it's about sex. It's about collecting data on sex. But despite the fact that, you know, it's such a sensitive issue, I got 80 signatures, including some you know, some of the most well-known names in quantitative social science and several fellows of the British Academy and so on and so forth. And I really thought at that point, oh, well, the Office for National Statistics will look at this and just, they'll listen to us. Of course they will, because we're the experts, aren't we? And anyway, it didn't quite pan out like that. As you know, they were quite resistant. And I went through a process of sort of trying to get them to listen to the mainstream opinion among data users, so people who use quantitative data sets. So of course the census matters for every data collection exercise, because it's what you compare it to. If you want to know whether your sample is representative, and you've done a survey, so you've sampled your population, you don't have the whole population, what you compare it to is the census, because they have the whole population, or as near as damn it, you know, that's what they're aiming for, is to get everybody. So it matters for everybody whether they actually directly using census data or not. It also matters a lot because of the precedent. A lot of other data collection exercises, including both social science and administrative data exercises, will look at the questions in the census and the guidance in the census and just copy it. You know, they think, well, these guys are the experts, you know, so we'll just do what they do. So that was another very strong reason to be concerned that if ONS were watering down sex, then we would lose sex across the board.
Yeah. So, and it just, again, partly for my benefit, partly for the listeners, in terms of other data users of the ONS, government, health, prison.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's across the board. This is your baseline for everything.
Okay.
So anyway, we got into this process of trying to engage with ONS, and it became obvious that there was a particular kind of political line that, oh no, we're not going to acknowledge that sex is a real binary variable. And we had this idea of, you know, sex isn't, nobody really knows what sex is. Who knows what sex is? You know, this very, very strange idea. So we were trying to pin them down on, they were talking about methodology and response rates and so on. We were saying, look, okay, but first of all, we have to agree what sex is, because if you don't know what you're trying to measure, how can you know whether you've measured it well? You know, any amount of testing will not tell you anything if you don't know what you're trying to measure.
That would be the same as, you know, you have to define anything that you're measuring. So if you're measuring religion or religiosity, you have to operationalize that in some fashion, don't you? Right. So, you know, attends a church or place of worship 7 times a week or something like that. And sex in this instance is no different than that, is it?
It's only different in the sense that in the past, no one ever, it's like some of these questions are really difficult. Like I did my PhD developing an operationalization for cultural capital. Well, that's quite hard because it's quite a sort of grand concept. How am I going to measure this grand theoretical concept? Sex is a bit different because people have been measuring it quite comfortably for a long, long time in one of 2 ways. One would be simply to observe and tick a box, and the interviewer just does it with no interview in a face-to-face. And that's how, you know, when the census first started, that's how it would have been done. Right. And then the other way is just to ask people, and people do know what sex they are. So it's never been deemed problematic until very, very recently. And the reason it's now being deemed problematic is entirely political and is about gender ideology. And what we found was that ONS, they did talk to a few of us quantitative social scientists, but they sort of balanced us off with 2 sets of people. One of whom was, you know, people who are clearly political stakeholders rather than data stakeholders, who tended to all sing from a particular, dare I say, stonewalled hymn sheet. And then I think even more insidiously, there were 6 academics that they brought into a round table to talk to them about this stuff. And they balanced us off with 6 academics who were chosen for political reasons. So, and from a range of disciplines. I think one of them was a quantitative social scientist, but the other 5 absolutely not. One of them was a theologian. So, and this is where you get into, this is, yeah.
Would they have done that with any other question?
Of course not. No, of course not. So it's one thing to engage with people who represent a group of people. So if you're trying to decide, you know, how to ask about religion, as you said, that's a good example, because the ONS may well be lobbied by people who say, actually, you know, being a Sikh or being a Jew or whatever isn't just religion, it's also a cultural identity, and we want you to ask about it in this way. But they're representing respondents. So they're representing the people filling the census in. ONS should not be confused about the difference between respondents and data users. And they were trying to make out these people are data users when they had never used data in their lives. You know, they're talking about your data needs. And it's like, well, if you're a theologian, do you really have data needs? I don't think so. So, and we heard some very, very strange things in that meeting. So actually, there was one person, and this was not the theologian. One person said, sex imagines biology, but isn't quite biology. And this is the kind of thing that if you were in a gender studies department, you might have to deal with people who talk in this kind of mumbo jumbo. I'm sorry, but that's all it is.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it, really? Because I'm not playing devil's advocate, but I am kind of playing devil's advocate. There's a huge paradigm difference, isn't there, between people who do empirical work, and particularly people who do empirical, you know, quantitative empirical, you know, sociology and other social sciences. Not versus, but on the other hand, there are also other types and streams of disciplines that are actually extremely esoteric, are theoretical, and probably wouldn't be able to handle an analysis of the empirical realities, i.e. life as it is lived, as opposed to these more abstracted discussions. So I can understand that statement that your person made, but I have no idea how that statement would be relevant to an exercise with the ONS and operationalizing any category.
Well, bravo to you for understanding the statement. I don't understand the statement. It's just mumbo jumbo to me. And it's not the kind of thing that I ever expect to hear in a meeting that's discussing questionnaire design, because it's an entirely different paradigm. People who are involved in quantitative social science are about the pursuit of truth, finding out about the realities in the external world, whereas there are other corners of academia which are not about the pursuit of truth. And up till now, those people had never impinged on my world. So I was able to just ignore them. And now something's happened and they've become very activist, and they want to dominate, and they not only want to do their own thing, which is not about the pursuit of truth, but they want to prevent anyone from doing the pursuit of truth. And that's very disturbing, and something that I think we all have to be really vigilant about.
I mean, I love this part of the discussion. Do you mind if we move a little bit away from the ONS? I know I said I wanted to talk to you about it, but you just raised that thing it's like my bête noire, or not bête noire. I have a real special interest in this, and that's how we as professional academics, because all of us, no matter what discipline we're coming from, we are credentialized, we have PhDs, we've gone through adequate training, we're usually members of learned societies, we exist within a community of practice, so we are in most respects professionals who adhere to a set of systems or a set of ethics, at least, in the production of knowledge. Now, you refer to the pursuit of truth, and I understand that, because in the world that you operate within, being, you know, a quantitative sociologist, there is the external reality out there that we need to somehow more or less faithfully represent as best we can. I exist in a slightly different world. I rely on people like you to do your work, because without your work, I can't make statements like, women are, women suffer all sorts of injustices. They do not have equal protection by the law, nor do they have equal access to the law, because we see all of X number of women being victimized with no recourse to criminal justice, or, the best one, in excess of 90% of women in, Britain's prison system have had some form of male violence in their history. So
Yeah.
I rely on stats, that representation rule. But do you think that there is an increasing tendency within academia, right, professional academics, to get very confused, and I mean this in the nicest possible way, to get very confused between the task of producing knowledge and doing politics? Because to me, forgive me, this is supposed to be your interview, but to me, producing knowledge is about being able to ask any and all questions in the pursuit of that thing called knowledge or truth. But politics requires that we shut the world down, essentialize it, say, this is the way it is, and this is what we need to do to solve that problem. Do you understand what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think, the thing is that good politics is actually based on good evidence. But I think that you're absolutely right, that there's a strand of activism within academia that isn't about that kind of politics, but which is about trying to impose a particular worldview. One of the first things I read when I fell down this rabbit hole and was like trying to understand what the hell is going on is Alice Drager's book on Galileo's middle finger, which is all about
that today.
Sorry,
you're the second person who's referenced that today.
Oh really?
Tell me,
yeah
tell me about it.
Well, I would really recommend anyone who wants to understand what's going on in universities reads that book. It's all about the conflict between activism and scholarship in academia. And of course, she's writing about the US, where this is all North American cultural imperialism that we're suffering from here. This is a problem that has been exported to us from the US. So they have it worse than us, and they're further down the line. And if we want to understand what's happening and try and tackle it, we need to pay attention to what's going on over there. I think I see people all the time saying, oh, it's not so bad, we haven't had too many people being no platformed, etc., etc. And it feels a bit like people are putting their heads in the sand. Imagine remember back in the 1980s, we used to look at Americans and go, God, they're so fat. Isn't it awful how fat they are? Imagine if instead we'd said, oh, they have an obesity epidemic. We're probably suffering some of the same social trends, and we might be a few years down the line from them. How are we going to, can we learn from them and tackle this? So this is how I wish people would look at it. Like, even if you think it's not that bad, maybe we could try and nip it in the bud. Maybe that's okay, great if it's not that bad.
Yeah,
but
why
that
does it
doesn't
have to
mean
get that bad?
yeah, exactly. I think it's something to add to that is just I think universities are kind of sleepwalking into this, in that they are embedding activists into the administration. So that seems to be one of the main ways that, because I think it's a tiny number actually of academics who want to shut down discussion and debate and stop other people from speaking, but they're very influential. And that's often because, for example, they take EDI roles, which then give them power over other academics. So for example, when we organized a conference at UCL on Women's Liberation 2020, there were a tiny handful of academics signed something to try and get that shut down. Tiny handful, and there's like 7,000 academics at UCL. Wow. So you could look at that and go, well, this is great, there's hardly any academics who want to shut down debate, but they were all faculty EDI people. And up until the morning of that conference, we did not know whether it was going to go ahead. And it's great that it did go ahead, but the fact is that all of those people who made defamatory statements about the organizers and tried to get the conference shut down are still in those roles, still discriminating against women and still discriminating against protected beliefs. So there is a real problem about if it was just a handful of activists within universities, you say, oh, fine, you know, who cares? But they're embedded in roles where they have power. And that, I think, is the belly of the beast and what needs to be tackled.
So just talk to, because we've got maybe about 5 minutes left. In an earlier conversation, you and I were talking about ethics committees, and we were talking about how some of this censoring has, I'm just going to call it censoring, because to me it's a form of political censoring rather than academic criticism or critique or anything like that. So just in the routine everyday world of your experience, talk to me about some of those smaller acts that we need to actually be paying attention to, and the reason why.
Yeah, so I think that when people talk about academic freedom, and particularly in the context of the current legislation that's going through, there's a big focus on no platforming. And I do think that no platforming is a symptom, but it is not the disease. So it's a very bad sign when people are being no platformed, but there are more serious things than that going on. So for example, when we hear about ethics committees turning people down to do research on trans issues, like research on detransitioners that was turned down by an ethics committee at Bath Spa, that's very disturbing. But I have also heard of ethics committees at more than one Russell Group university telling people they cannot collect data on sex and even data on race, I would add, which is like, it's incredibly shocking. So,
and I mean, just talk us through the examples that you've had, and we'll stick to sex. So is this as just part of the descriptive statistics, or, you know, the descriptive part of data collection?
Yeah, so, I don't know all the details because I wasn't sort of party to what happened, but I'm talking about literally just collecting from the individual that you're researching
their sex,
what their sex is. So that is, to me, even more serious than shutting down events. It's
sorry about the dog bark. Never work with children in live animals.
But I'd also say that, you know, for every no platforming that you hear about, there are many more cases of kind of more subtle pressure on people. So it's like I've given presentations a couple of times recently and then heard about disturbing things that have happened afterwards. So in one case, an EDI person spoke to the seminar organizer and asked him to explain why he had invited me. So I wasn't no platformed. Everything
the person who invited you had to justify.
Yeah. And in another case, someone was harassed simply for having attended a seminar that I gave. And this was someone who didn't even ask a question, was completely silent. So being mobbed essentially for listening to a point of view. And that seems, it's so profoundly anti-intellectual. And we need to do more than just not give way to no platforming. We need to be actively, I think, explaining to people what academic freedom is, why it matters. I think we need training, actually, both for students but also for staff.
Well, I have to say, you know, we'll kind of draw an end around now. I have to say that my dog in this bone, if I have a dog in this bone, my dog in this fight, if I have a dog in this fight, has far more to do with academic freedom and professional ethics, because it strikes me that the first professional ethic that we have as academics is to the production of knowledge.
Yeah.
And that we can't do that unless we can use the concepts that work for us, develop those concepts, operationalize them, describe the world around us, ask questions, have discussions, you know, and just actually be involved in the business of exploring. ideas.
I fully agree. It is antithetical both to learning and to producing knowledge as a public good for policymakers, for the population as a whole. If we cannot refer, for example, to known facts, whether in the classroom or within the context of research, how can you develop knowledge and learning if there are certain truths which are unspeakable?
Yeah, I think that that's a perfect place to end. I want to thank you very much, but there's also another thank you that I want to extend to you. I haven't been able to publicly do it, so please take this as a public thank you. You have been one of the founding members of this research network. We have come in for an awful lot of fun, and I, as one of your colleagues, want to thank you for standing still and standing firm with us through the last month, because it's been quite a month.
Thank you, Joe. And yeah, it's what you've been through is absurd.
Yeah,
and it should never happen in a university.
But it's all in the name of making sure we live by the ethics that we espouse. So on that note, Alice, thank you. I'll stop the recording now.